If you'd asked me a year ago if I'd ever do something to betray my husband, I would have laughed at the absurdity. Paul was my rock, my partner of 10 years, and the father of our 2 children. But life has a way of pulling you into places you never imagined you'd go. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of the worst decision I ever made, and the tangled web it created. Paul and his younger brother, Nathan, had always been close. They were opposites in many ways. Paul, steady and responsible, had taken on the role of caretaker after their parents passed away when they were teenagers. Nathan, on the other hand, was the carefree one, always chasing adventure and living in the moment. Despite their differences, there was an unspoken bond between them, one built on shared memories and mutual respect. When Nathan moved back to our city last year, I was thrilled for Paul. He'd missed his brother, and I hoped having him around would bring some lightness to our lives. Nathan had always been charming, the life of every party, and he had a way of making people feel seen. But I never thought that charm would turn into something dangerous. It started innocently enough. Nathan would come over for dinner, regaling us with stories of his travels and cracking jokes that had everyone in stitches. The kids adored him, and even Paul, who was often the first to roll his eyes at Nathan's antics, seemed genuinely happy to have him around. At first, I saw Nathan as an extension of Paul, a bit of his wild, untamed spirit that I'd always admired but never quite understood. But as time went on, our conversations grew more personal. Nathan had a way of asking questions that made me feel important, like my thoughts and feelings truly mattered. He'd listen intently, his eyes locked on mine, and for the first time in years, I felt truly seen. Paul, meanwhile, was busier than ever at work, often coming home late and exhausted. Our conversations had become transactional, focused on schedules and responsibilities. I told myself it was just a phase, that all marriages went through ebbs and flows, but the loneliness I felt was hard to ignore. One evening, after Paul had fallen asleep on the couch, Nathan and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. We were cleaning up after dinner, the kids already tucked into bed, and the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the dishwasher. "You've been holding everything together," Nathan said suddenly, his voice low. I looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" He leaned against the counter, his expression serious. "You're doing so much for Paul and the kids. I don't know how you do it." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "It's just what you do when you're a mom," I said, trying to brush it off. "Still," he said, his gaze steady. "You deserve to be appreciated for it." His words hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for, and I found myself blinking back tears. "Thank you," I said softly, turning back to the sink. That night, as I lay in bed beside Paul, his soft snores filling the room, I couldn't stop thinking about what Nathan had said. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he'd looked at me, like I was someone worth noticing. Over the weeks that followed, Nathan and I grew closer. It wasn't intentional, not at first. We'd find ourselves talking after family dinners, or exchanging texts about the kids. He had a way of making me laugh, of reminding me that there was more to me than being a wife and mother. But as our connection deepened, I started to notice the way he looked at me lingered just a little too long, or the way his hand would brush against mine when he passed me a plate. I told myself it was harmless, that it was just Nathan being Nathan. Until one evening, when Paul was out of town for a work conference. Nathan had stopped by to drop off a gift for the kids, a Lego set he'd picked up on a whim, and stayed for dinner. After the kids were in bed, we sat on the couch with a bottle of wine, the conversation flowing easily. "I've missed this," he said suddenly, his voice softer than usual. "Missed what?" I asked, confused. "Being around family," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "Feeling like I belong somewhere." "You've always belonged here," I said, smiling. His gaze lingered on mine, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged. "You're incredible, Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, my heart racing as I tried to process his words. Nathan, I. Before I could finish, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. The kiss was brief, hesitant, and when he pulled back, his expression was filled with both longing and regret. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, standing and running a hand through his hair. "I shouldn't have done that." I sat there, stunned, as he grabbed his coat and left without another word. As the door clicked shut behind him, I felt a rush of emotions, confusion, guilt, and a strange, undeniable thrill. I knew I should feel angry, that I should call Paul and tell him what had happened, but instead, I sat there in silence, replaying the moment in my mind. It was the beginning of something I couldn't stop. After that night, everything changed. I woke up the next morning determined to put the kiss behind me, to treat it like the fleeting mistake it was. But the more I tried to push it out of my mind, the more it lingered. Nathan's words, his touch, the way he looked at me, it played on a loop in my head, a mix of guilt and longing I couldn't untangle. When Paul returned from his trip, he greeted me with his usual warmth, oblivious to the turmoil I was hiding. I threw myself into our routines, cooking his favorite meals, organizing the kids' activities, and pretending everything was fine. But beneath the surface, I was a mess. Nathan, to his credit, kept his distance. He didn't come over as often, and when he did, he made sure not to be alone with me. But the tension was still there, crackling between us like static electricity. Every glance, every brief interaction, felt loaded with meaning. One afternoon, while Paul was at work and the kids were at school, Nathan showed up unexpectedly. He stood on the porch, his hands shoved in his pockets, looking hesitant. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. "I think we said everything we needed to the other night," I said, closing the door behind him. "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But I can't stop thinking about it. About you." "Nathan, this has to stop," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Does it?" he asked, his gaze locking onto mine. "Tell me you don't feel the same, and I'll walk away. I swear." I opened my mouth to deny it, to shut it down once and for all, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself staring at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Sarah," he said softly, stepping closer. Before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us, my lips meeting his. It was as if a dam had broken, all the tension and longing we'd been holding back spilling out in that single, reckless moment. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what we'd done hit me like a tidal wave. "This is wrong," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his expression filled with regret. "But it doesn't change how I feel." I didn't know how to respond. I felt torn between the life I'd built with Paul and the undeniable pull I felt toward Nathan. "You should go," I said finally. He nodded, his shoulders sagging as he headed for the door. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said before leaving. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and confusion. I tried to throw myself into my marriage, to focus on Paul and the kids, but my mind kept drifting back to Nathan. Every time I saw him, it was like a magnet pulling me closer, no matter how hard I tried to resist. One evening, after dinner, Paul mentioned that Nathan had been acting distant lately. "I think something's bothering him," he said, frowning. "I'll talk to him this weekend." My stomach twisted at the thought. I knew Paul wouldn't suspect anything, but the idea of him digging into Nathan's feelings left me uneasy. When the weekend came, Paul invited Nathan over for a barbecue. The kids were thrilled to see their uncle, running around the yard while the three of us sat on the porch, beers in hand. Nathan was his usual charming self, laughing and joking as if nothing had happened, but I could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. At one point, Paul stepped inside to grab more drinks, leaving Nathan and me alone. "We can't keep doing this," I said quietly, my voice shaking. "I know," he said, his tone serious. "But we need to figure out what we're going to do." Before I could respond, Paul returned, and the moment was lost. But the weight of Nathan's words stayed with me, a reminder that we were on borrowed time. That night, as I lay in bed beside Paul, I realized how deep I'd fallen. I didn't want to hurt him, I loved him, or at least, I thought I did. But I couldn't deny the connection I felt with Nathan, no matter how wrong it was. I knew I was standing at a crossroads, and whichever path I chose, someone was going to get hurt. By the time autumn rolled around, my life had become a delicate balancing act, teetering on the edge of collapse. Nathan and I had crossed a line we couldn't uncross, and every stolen moment between us only tangled the web of lies further. At home, I tried to focus on Paul and the kids, pretending that everything was fine, but the guilt was a constant weight in my chest. Nathan, for his part, tried to keep his distance, but the pull between us was impossible to ignore. We'd exchange glances at family dinners, brush against each other in passing, and find ourselves alone more often than could be explained by coincidence. Each time, we swore it would be the last, but the promises were empty, shattered the moment we were together again. One Friday evening, Paul invited Nathan over to watch a game. The kids were at a sleepover, and I told myself I'd stay out of the way, but when Nathan arrived, I felt the familiar pull. He greeted me with a smile that lingered just a little too long, his eyes betraying the tension neither of us could name out loud. As Paul and Nathan settled in front of the TV, I busied myself in the kitchen, hoping the noise of chopping vegetables would drown out my thoughts. But when Paul stepped out to take a call, Nathan appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "We need to stop this," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his tone soft but firm. "But that doesn't mean I want to." Before I could respond, Paul's footsteps echoed down the hall, and Nathan stepped back, leaving me breathless and panicked. That night, as I lay in bed beside Paul, I couldn't stop thinking about how close we'd come to being discovered. It was a wake-up call, or at least, it should have been. But instead of ending things with Nathan, I found myself slipping deeper into the deception. The turning point came a few weeks later, during a family gathering at Paul's parents' house. Nathan and I had managed to avoid each other for most of the evening, but when I stepped outside to get some air, I found him sitting on the porch steps, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. "You don't smoke," I said, sitting down beside him. "Maybe I do now," he replied with a wry smile. We sat in silence for a moment, the cool autumn air heavy with unspoken words. "This is a mess," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "But I don't regret it." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. "Nathan, we can't keep doing this. It's not fair to Paul." "Do you think I don't know that?" he said, his voice raw. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Sarah. And I don't think you can, either." The truth of his words hung between us, undeniable and suffocating. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, tears streaming down my face. "We'll figure it out," he said, his tone softening. "But not here. Not like this." When we returned to the party, I felt like I was wearing a mask, smiling and laughing with the family while the weight of my secret threatened to crush me. Paul, ever attentive, noticed my distraction. "Are you okay?" he asked as we drove home. "I'm fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. But I wasn't fine. I was spiraling, and the lies were becoming harder to keep straight. I avoided Nathan as much as I could, but every time I saw him, it was like a magnet pulling me back into the chaos. One evening, after the kids were asleep, Paul confronted me. "You've been distant lately," he said, his tone cautious. "I'm just tired," I said, avoiding his gaze. "It's more than that," he pressed. "If something's wrong, I want to know." For a moment, I thought about telling him the truth, about laying everything bare and begging for his forgiveness. But the fear of losing him, of losing everything, held me back. "I'm fine," I said again, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. Paul didn't look convinced, but he didn't push further. Instead, he nodded slowly and walked away, leaving me alone with the weight of my choices. As I sat in the darkened living room, I realized how far I'd fallen. I was living a double life, and the walls were closing in. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. I was caught in a web of my own making, and I had no idea how to untangle it. Life had become a delicate, exhausting charade. Every day was spent balancing the image of the devoted wife and mother I was supposed to be with the dangerous, forbidden connection I couldn't let go of. The pressure was mounting, and I could feel the cracks beginning to form. Nathan and I tried to keep our distance, but it was futile. The more we told ourselves it was over, the harder it became to stay away. Each stolen glance, each fleeting touch, only deepened the pull between us. We knew we were playing with fire, but neither of us could stop. It wasn't just the guilt that was eating away at me, it was the paranoia. Every time Paul looked at me for a second too long, I felt like he could see right through me. Every innocent question from the kids about Uncle Nathan made my stomach churn. Even the most mundane moments felt loaded with suspicion. The tipping point came one Saturday afternoon. Paul had invited Nathan over to watch the game, and I spent most of the day trying to stay out of their way. But as the hours dragged on, the tension in the house became unbearable. At one point, Paul left to pick up snacks from the store, leaving Nathan and me alone. The moment the door closed, Nathan stood, his expression conflicted. "We need to talk," he said. I shook my head, backing away. "Not now, Nathan. Please." "Yes, now," he insisted, his voice low but firm. "This is getting out of control, Sarah. We need to figure out what we're doing." "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know what to do anymore." Nathan's face softened, and he reached for my hand. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently. Before I could respond, the sound of the front door opening sent us scrambling apart. Paul walked in, bags in hand, and gave us a curious look. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual but tinged with suspicion. "Of course," I said quickly, forcing a smile. Paul nodded, but the way his eyes lingered on us made my heart race. That evening, as we sat at the dinner table, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Paul was unusually quiet, his gaze flicking between me and Nathan as if he was trying to piece something together. I did my best to act normal, laughing at the kids' jokes and asking about Paul's day, but my nerves were shot. When Nathan finally left, Paul turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You've been acting strange lately," he said. "I'm just tired," I said, the lie coming out automatically. Paul studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Right," he said, his tone flat. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I was running out of time. The next morning, Karen, a nosy neighbor who thrived on gossip, cornered me at the grocery store. "So," she said, her tone overly casual, "I hear Nathan's been spending a lot of time at your place." I froze, my mind racing for a response. "He's family," I said, keeping my tone light. "Paul and the kids love having him around." Karen smiled, but her eyes were sharp. "Of course," she said. "It's just nice to see siblings so close, you know." I forced a laugh, but the encounter left me rattled. If Karen had noticed something, how many others had? When I got home, Paul was in the kitchen, sipping his coffee. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Fine," I said, setting down the groceries. He didn't respond, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. That evening, as we sat on the porch after putting the kids to bed, Paul finally spoke. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady but cautious, "is there something you're not telling me?" My heart stopped, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "I don't know," he said, his gaze piercing. "You've been distant. And the way you and Nathan act around each other." I swallowed hard, my mind racing for an explanation. "It's nothing," I said quickly. "You're imagining things." Paul didn't look convinced, but he didn't press further. Instead, he nodded slowly and stood, heading back inside without another word. As I sat alone on the porch, I realized how close I was to losing everything. The cracks in my life were widening, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The next few weeks felt like living inside a ticking clock, each second louder than the last. I could sense it, Paul's growing suspicion, Nathan's quiet frustration, and my own spiraling guilt. The walls were closing in, and no matter how hard I tried to maintain control, the cracks were beginning to show. Paul's questions became more frequent and pointed. "Are you sure everything's okay?" he asked one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "I told you, I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. He studied me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you?" "Of course," I lied, my stomach twisting in knots. At night, I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling and wondering how long I could keep up the charade. My mind replayed every moment with Nathan, every stolen glance and whispered word, and I felt the weight of my betrayal crushing me. Nathan, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly restless. He started pulling away, his messages becoming less frequent, his visits shorter. When we did see each other, his frustration was palpable. "This isn't sustainable, Sarah," he said one afternoon when we found ourselves alone after a family dinner. "I know," I said quietly, avoiding his gaze. "So what are we doing?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of anger and desperation. "Because I can't keep pretending this doesn't mean something." I didn't know how to answer him. The truth was, I didn't know what I was doing anymore. I was caught between two worlds, unable to commit to either, and it was tearing me apart. The breaking point came one Saturday when Paul invited Nathan over to help build a new swing set for the kids. It was a bright, sunny day, and the yard was filled with laughter and the sound of power tools. But beneath the surface, the tension was suffocating. At one point, while the kids were inside grabbing snacks, Nathan pulled me aside. "We need to talk," he said, his tone urgent. "Not now," I said quickly, glancing toward the house. "When, then?" he pressed. "Because this is killing me, Sarah. I need to know where we stand." Before I could respond, Paul stepped outside, his gaze flicking between us. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with suspicion. "Nothing," I said quickly, stepping back. Paul's eyes lingered on Nathan for a moment before he nodded slowly. "Let's get back to work," he said, his tone clipped. The rest of the afternoon was unbearable. Paul barely spoke, his jaw tight and his movements stiff. When Nathan left, he barely said goodbye, and I could feel the tension radiating off him as he watched his brother drive away. That evening, after the kids were in bed, Paul confronted me. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady but firm, "what's going on between you and Nathan?" My heart stopped, and I struggled to find the words. "What do you mean?" I asked, stalling for time. "You know exactly what I mean," he said, his gaze piercing. "I've seen the way you look at each other, the way you act when he's around. Something's not right, and I need you to tell me the truth." For a moment, I thought about denying it, about doubling down on the lies I'd been telling for months. But the look in Paul's eyes, the hurt, the anger, the desperation, made it impossible. "I made a mistake," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Paul's jaw tightened, and he took a step back. "With Nathan?" Tears streamed down my face as I nodded. "It wasn't supposed to happen," I said, my voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you." Paul didn't say anything for a long time, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury. Finally, he shook his head. "I need some time," he said quietly before walking out the door. As I sat alone in the silence of our living room, I realized that the life I'd worked so hard to hold together was beginning to crumble. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The hours after Paul walked out were some of the longest of my life. The house was quiet, the kids asleep upstairs, and I sat in the dim light of the living room, replaying our conversation over and over in my mind. His words, "I need some time," echoed in my ears, a cruel reminder of the pain I had caused. I didn't know where he'd gone, and I didn't dare call him. Part of me feared that he wouldn't answer, that he needed more than a few hours to process the betrayal I had just confessed. Another part of me feared what he might be thinking, what decisions he might be making in the silence of his absence. When Paul finally came home in the early hours of the morning, I was still sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket and holding a cold cup of tea. He didn't say anything as he walked past me and into the bedroom, his face unreadable. I followed him, desperate to bridge the chasm that had formed between us. "Paul," I said softly, standing in the doorway. "Not now," he said, his voice low but firm. "I can't talk to you right now." I nodded, tears streaming down my face, and went back to the living room, where I spent the rest of the night staring out the window. The next morning, Paul was already gone when the kids woke up, and I scrambled to put on a brave face as they asked where he was. "He had to leave early for work," I lied, my voice shaking. By the time Paul came home that evening, the kids were in bed, and the tension between us was palpable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but cold. I nodded, sitting down at the kitchen table as he remained standing, his arms crossed. "I've been trying to wrap my head around this," he began, his tone measured. "But no matter how I look at it, I can't understand why you would do this. With my brother, Sarah. How could you?" "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "It wasn't planned. It just happened." "That's not an answer," he snapped, his voice rising. "You don't just fall into an affair, especially not with someone so close to me." I was lonely, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. "We were so distant, Paul. I felt invisible, and Nathan." "Don't," he interrupted, his jaw tightening. "Don't try to justify this by blaming me." "I'm not," I said quickly. "I take full responsibility for what I did. I just want to fix this. I want to fix us." Paul stared at me for a long moment, his expression a mix of anger and heartbreak. "I don't know if we can fix this," he said quietly. His words felt like a knife to the chest, but I nodded, knowing that I couldn't expect anything else. Over the next few days, we barely spoke. Paul avoided me whenever possible, leaving early for work and spending his evenings in the garage. The kids noticed the tension, but I did my best to reassure them, hiding my tears until they were asleep. Nathan, meanwhile, texted me repeatedly, asking if I was okay, but I didn't respond. The thought of seeing him, of trying to explain what had happened, was too much to bear. A week later, Paul suggested we go to counseling. "If there's even a chance we can make this work," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "we need help." I agreed immediately, desperate to do whatever it took to repair the damage I had caused. Our first session was brutal, with Paul airing every ounce of his anger and betrayal while I sat in silence, unable to defend myself. "You humiliated me," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You betrayed my trust, my family, and everything we built together." "I know," I said, my voice breaking. "And I'm so sorry. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you let me." The counselor, a kind but firm woman named Margaret, guided us through the session, encouraging us to be honest but also to listen to each other. "Healing takes time," she said. "It's not just about forgiveness, it's about understanding why this happened and deciding if you can move forward together." The sessions continued, each one peeling back another layer of pain and resentment. Paul was brutally honest about how much I had hurt him, and I was forced to confront the selfishness of my actions. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in months, it felt like we were at least moving in the right direction. As the weeks passed, Paul began to soften, though the pain in his eyes never fully disappeared. We started having small conversations at home, laughing at Owen's jokes, and sharing quiet moments that felt almost normal. But Nathan remained a shadow over our lives. Paul hadn't spoken to him since the truth came out, and I couldn't bring myself to reach out either. The bond between the brothers had been severed, and I knew it was my fault. One evening, as Paul and I sat on the porch after putting the kids to bed, he turned to me. "Do you still love him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I said quickly, the truth spilling out before I could think. "I never did. It wasn't about love, Paul. It was a mistake, a terrible, selfish mistake." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you," he said. "But I'm willing to try." His words brought tears to my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The days after Paul's tentative promise to try were a mix of cautious optimism and lingering tension. We had agreed to move forward, but the path ahead was anything but clear. Counseling sessions continued to be a cornerstone of our fragile progress, each one peeling back more layers of hurt and mistrust. Paul was honest about his feelings, never sugarcoating the depth of his pain. "It's not just the betrayal," he said during one session. "It's who you betrayed me with. Nathan was my brother. He was supposed to be someone I could trust." His words cut deep, but I knew he was right. "I'll never be able to undo what I did," I said, my voice trembling. "But I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild your trust." Rebuilding trust was a slow, painstaking process. I made a point of being completely transparent, leaving my phone unlocked, sharing my schedule, and answering every question Paul asked, no matter how uncomfortable it made me. It was exhausting at times, but I knew it was the least I could do. At home, things with the kids felt almost normal. Owen and Lily were blissfully unaware of the storm that had shaken their family, and their laughter was a constant reminder of why I needed to keep fighting for us. But the shadow of Nathan still loomed over everything. Paul hadn't spoken to him since the night of my confession, and I had no idea what Nathan was feeling or thinking. I wanted to reach out, to offer some sort of closure, but I knew it wasn't my place. This wasn't just my wound to heal, it was Paul's. One evening, as we sat on the porch after putting the kids to bed, Paul finally brought up Nathan. "Do you think he regrets it?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes heavy with emotion. "I think he does," I said carefully. "But I haven't spoken to him, so I don't know." Paul nodded, staring out at the darkened yard. "He hasn't tried to reach out to me," he said quietly. "Maybe he's afraid," I offered. "Good," Paul said, his voice hard. "He should be." The bitterness in his tone was a stark reminder of how far we still had to go. A few weeks later, Paul surprised me by suggesting we go on a date. "I think we need to remember what it's like to just be us," he said, his tone hesitant but sincere. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what to expect. We went to a small Italian restaurant we used to frequent before we had kids, the familiar atmosphere bringing back memories of happier times. The conversation was awkward at first, but as the night went on, we found ourselves laughing and reminiscing. "I missed this," Paul admitted as we shared a slice of cheesecake. "Me too," I said softly, my heart swelling with hope. The evening felt like a step forward, a reminder of what we were fighting for. But I knew one good night couldn't erase the pain of the past. The true test came a few weeks later when Nathan unexpectedly showed up at our door. Paul and I were in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when the knock came. When I opened the door and saw Nathan standing there, my stomach dropped. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I need to talk to Paul," he said, his expression tense. Before I could respond, Paul appeared behind me. His face hardened when he saw Nathan, and for a moment, I thought he might slam the door in his face. But instead, he stepped aside. "Come in," he said coldly. The three of us sat in the living room, the air thick with tension. Nathan was the first to speak. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said, his voice steady but filled with regret. But I need you to know how sorry I am. I never meant to hurt you. Paul stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. You didn't just hurt me, Nathan. You betrayed me. You betrayed our family. I know, Nathan said, his voice breaking. And I'll spend the rest of my life regretting it. Paul didn't respond, his jaw tight as he fought to keep his emotions in check. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, he said finally. But for the sake of my family, I need to move on. That means we keep our distance, Nathan. You're not welcome here anymore. Nathan nodded, tears streaming down his face as he stood to leave. I'm sorry, he said again before walking out the door. As the door clicked shut, I turned to Paul, my heart aching for him. Are you okay? I asked softly. I don't know, he admitted, his voice raw. But I think that was a step in the right direction. In the weeks that followed, things between Paul and me slowly began to improve. We started spending more time together, rediscovering the connection that had been buried under years of neglect and betrayal. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of anger and doubt, but we were trying. For the first time in months, I felt like there was hope for us. The weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, life began to feel a little less fragile. Paul and I were still far from where we wanted to be, but the small victories, an evening spent laughing together, a shared glance of understanding, gave me hope that we were moving in the right direction. Counseling continued to play a central role in our progress. Paul remained guarded, his pain still evident, but he was willing to open up more than he had before. It's not just about forgiving you, he said during one session. It's about forgiving myself for not seeing what was happening. For trusting Nathan. His words broke my heart, but they also gave me a window into his resilience. He was working as hard as I was to piece our lives back together, even though he had every reason to walk away. At home, things felt more stable. The kids seemed happier, and Paul and I started building new routines, movie nights with the family, weekend hikes, and quiet moments on the porch after the kids were asleep. It wasn't the life we had before, but maybe that was a good thing. Nathan, true to Paul's wishes, kept his distance. He moved to another city, taking a job that allowed him to start fresh. Occasionally, I'd hear about him through family members, but I didn't reach out, and neither did he. It was an unspoken agreement, a necessary distance that allowed us all to heal. One evening, as Paul and I sat together in the backyard, watching the kids chase fireflies, he turned to me. Do you ever think about what could have happened if things had gone differently? He asked, his tone thoughtful. All the time, I admitted. I think about how close I came to losing everything that matters to me. And how lucky I am that you were willing to give us another chance. He nodded, his gaze distant. It's not just about giving you a chance, Sarah. It's about giving us a chance. I don't want to live in the past anymore. His words were a balm to my soul, a reminder that even after everything we'd been through, there was still a foundation worth building on. The journey to forgiveness wasn't linear, and there were still moments of doubt and pain. But each step we took together felt like a triumph, a testament to the strength of our commitment to each other and our family. As the kids came running toward us, their laughter filling the air, Paul reached for my hand. We've still got a long way to go, he said, his grip firm but gentle. I know, I said, squeezing his hand. But I'm not going anywhere. And in that moment, as the fireflies danced around us and the past began to feel like a distant memory, I realized that we weren't just rebuilding what we'd lost, we were creating something new, something stronger. We were finally moving forward, together.